So I am the Research and Data Analysis Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which is an organization co-founded by my colleagues Kate Rayworth and Carlotta Santh, really to put the ideas that were written in a book called Doughnut Economics by Kate Rayworth into action. That basically people were starting to read this book and get fired up by the ideas and weren't waiting around for permission to put them into action. So we exist at Deal, really working with community leaders and business leaders and cities and regions and governments and so on, essentially helping to connect and make visible all of this energy that's already out there. And I'm delighted to share a little bit about it today. So where do I come from? I call myself an ecological economist. I discovered this field in 2010, so 13 years ago now. During my master's, I was 5 years into a Department of Economics, quite conventional economics training. Took a course almost by accident from a management school around environmental studies called Economics for Resource and Environmental Management. And I thought, well, they're not offering an environmental economics course in my program this year. So this sounds like what I'm looking for. Let me do it. It was a course in ecological economics. And I was the only mainstream economist in the class, everyone else in natural sciences or management. And my mind was blown, basically, because this course was centered on a critique, particularly around the scale of the economy. And this was something as a mainstream economist that I had never been exposed to. Questions like, how big should the economy be? How big is it? And how big should it be, essentially? So these were questions that got me really thinking. I felt a little bit silly because it had never occurred to me before to ask those types of questions of the size of the economy in relation to our finite planet. And that set me off on a whole lot of reading and asking questions and reading more. And it led me to Doughnut Economics and very deep down the rabbit hole of ecological economics. So that's where I'm coming from here today. And I just wanted to share some of what we call the 20th century economics, a subtle way of saying that we believe that this way of thinking about economics that I was taught is no longer, well, it's out of date. So the first picture that you see is essentially in economics, the picture of demand and supply, right? The X, where price and quantity are determined in an equilibrium. And what that does is it centers the market, right? And that idea that value is determined through price as shared in markets, it sidelines essentially anything that cannot be shared in markets. And so this notion of putting the markets front and center is something that in the 21st century, I think we need to step beyond. So that's the first image, the biggest image. So if you're looking at economics, here's the biggest image of the macro economy that you're likely to find. And you get, I won't go into all the details, but you have, essentially you see this circular flow of value going between households and businesses, and in the more extended versions, banks and government and trade. And this really forms the basis of our system of national accounts. And it's been quite useful in terms of seeing policy levers of if things are out of balance, then how do we rebalance them in this circular flow? But if you spend a bit of time with this image, you start to realize some core things that are missing. For example, the entirety of the natural living world is not there. And what we immediately see is that there's no source of energy or a sink for waste that's powering this circular flow, which of course, in the laws of thermodynamics is impossible. You also see that, we don't just show up as labor to work for businesses. We wake up in the morning in our households, we have families. There's a whole caring economy that's completely absent from this picture. And likewise, the commons, like where we are not in our households, but we're not working in the economy, there's all kinds of stewarding and co-creating and interactions that take place where money does not change hands, but which really form the basis of our social fabric. So a picture that doesn't include the natural living world, our households, or the commons, I believe is a need to really expand beyond that. So what's the picture of the selfie in 20th century economics? So Kate realized that rational economic man, Homo economicus, as he's known, didn't have actually a picture. So she drew him. She recognized that he was a man. He's always standing alone with no dependence or anyone. He has money in his hand, ego in his heart, and a calculator in his head, and the living world at his feet. So he knows the price of everything. He's constantly calculating. He hates work. He loves to consume. And he's just a caricature of really what it means to be a human. But what we found is particularly some interesting research looking at economics students is that actually the vision of ourselves that we tell ourselves that we are influences who we actually become. And that there's actually research showing that economics students tend to be more like Homo economicus than other disciplines. So this who we tell ourselves that we are makes a difference. Finally, the goal. At the macroeconomic level, in economics, there actually is no goal. There's no overarching purpose of the macroeconomy as articulated in 20th century economics. But one has crept in and almost undermined, stolen the show, and that is the ever-ending, endless accumulation of GDP or national income or gross domestic product. And we now are at a point in the 21st century, because of the system that we have inherited, that we are dependent on this endless accumulation or this constant growth of GDP. Because if we don't receive that growth, then very bad things happen. We call it a recession. People's livelihoods are at risk. And there's this dependence upon something that actually, if you take it to its logical conclusion, cannot continue on a finite planet. So these images, I think, underpin so many of the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century, and we've inherited them from the 20th century economic system. And really, it's worth taking a step back to think and recognize that the 21st century has been marked by a series of recurring global crises. We had the financial meltdown in 2008 and the decade of austerity in many places that followed that. We're living in an age of climate and ecological breakdown with floods and droughts and wildfires and much more. We're also living in an age of protest crackdown where especially environmental and land defenders and youth who are seeing their futures in very uncertain terms are rising up and protesting and being met with water cannons and increasing levels of repression by the world's governments and authorities. And of course, we're living through a third year now of COVID lockdown. We have just, as was mentioned, officially ended the pandemic. But of course, the impacts that we've all lived through in the past 3 years have been unprecedented. And I just want to note that the impacts of all of these crises have been felt disproportionately by age, by race, by gender, by wealth in the global north and in the global south. And that what they say to me essentially is that we are all interconnected, both with one another as well as with the rest of the living world, and that these crises are massively destabilizing and for some are existential even. And that we have largely, once again, inherited these. They arise out of the very systems that we have inherited. And so I believe that there's a fundamental need to transform this vision, to transform this picture that we have inherited. And thankfully, there's a pluriverse of visions that can take us beyond the 20th century economic systems and things that we have inherited. So I will present one. Here it is. It's shaped like a donut. That's why we call it Doughnut Economics. We think of it as a compass for human prosperity, where really the aims to show the goal to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So if we think of resource use almost radiating out from the middle of this donut, we want to make sure that all people have enough so that they can meet their fundamental needs for water, for food, for health, for education, peace and justice, social equity, gender equality, and so on. Make sure that everyone has enough to go above that social foundation and into the green space of the donut. And these social priorities have actually been crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can say with confidence that these are, I mean, the world's governments have agreed that these are the fundamental dimensions of what it means to be prosperous and to thrive, because that's what forms the basis of the social priorities of the SDGs. So make sure that everyone gets into that green space of the donut, but, and it's a big but, make sure that we don't overshoot the ecological ceiling, because then we start placing too much pressure on our planetary home. We start causing climate change and acidifying the oceans, and causing dead zones in ocean habitats, or destroying ecosystems and the critical biodiversity that they house. And so these 9 planetary boundaries are what Earth system scientists say maintain the stability of our planetary home. So we need to stay within those and keep ourselves within that green space of the donut. And to me, what this image shows is that all of a sudden, now we're not talking about the goal of endless accumulation. Now the goal is it's about balance, and it's about staying in that space in a dynamic kind of equilibrium. And so Kate drew this image in 2012. This is the most latest version, updated in her book in 2017. And she recognized that this image of balance was actually, if you look to many, many other cultures, it's really, the issue is more our Western mindset and the economic system that we have inherited. Because if you look to many, many other cultures, you see again and again this recurring theme of balance, of dynamic equilibrium, and of finding that safe and just space for humanity or for society. So really, we think of the donut as almost a Western developed concept that hopefully can serve as some kind of a bridge for our Western mindsets to relearn what has already been known for millennia by many, many other cultures and so on. So that's one picture of the donut. If that is our picture, then we know that today we are currently far, far out of balance. So this is all of these little red wedges on the inside of the donut. You can think of those, it's a global picture, the proportion of the global population who is falling short of their needs. So if you go around, you can see that there's billions of people who are not meeting their most essential basic needs. And they live in cities and nations, both rich and poor. While at the same time, we're overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. So the climate change boundary at the top, the ecological ceiling is 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And you can see that today we're overshooting that. We're around 416 parts per million, I believe. So, and actually the science around these planetary boundaries continues to advance. So this is the most updated science available, which paints an even more challenging picture. So to me, this is a very challenging picture in my view, but at the same time, it just really demonstrates that we need to transform our economic system from both sides at the same time. And that is not the economic system that we inherited. So it's almost liberating in a sense, because we know that we need new economic policies, new models, new theories, new ways of interacting that haven't been invented before. Because I'm so sure that when others, our children's children look at us and they pull from the archives this picture and other headlines, they're going to say to us, this picture was out there. You knew that this was happening. What did you do once that you knew? And that to me is a massive motivating force for why I do the work that I do. And I know that CIFOR is also very, very engaged with similar problems. So let's dive in. This is a global picture, but we know, of course, that the responsibility for overshooting planetary boundaries is held by some, and the capacity and the ability to meet the social foundation is overwhelmingly, it's held by others. But of course, those are interconnected through histories and legacies of colonialism and post-colonial, the world economic system that we live in. So how can we start teasing apart, given the focus of this conference around equity in action, of taking account of those responsibilities and gesturing towards the accountability of them? Well, one approach is to look at a single indicator and looking back over time. And this is some work that I've been doing with Jason Hickel around the climate change boundary. So on the left-hand side, you can see here, this is a chart showing cumulative carbon emissions with respect to climate targets. And the axis is labeled in such a way that the 1.5 degree remaining carbon budget, as determined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment, that equals 1. And on the x-axis, we can see from 1850 to 2019 historical emissions, and then from 2020 to 2050, a couple scenarios, one of which shows business as usual if we continue along the historical trends that we've been following over the past, almost 200 years. And then another scenario is the net zero, which shows that we looked at about 170 countries here, and this is the aggregate of all of them. And it shows that if all nations follow a net zero pathway, decarbonizing to 2050, then we will actually, it is still possible to stay within the 1.5 degree remaining carbon budget. But of course, that is what is needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, as per the most recent science. But of course, we know that if that were to be the case, then some people have emitted too much and some people have not emitted much at all. For example, if we look at the global north, which is a series of 39 countries, essentially Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, a handful of other rich industrialized countries, we can see that they cross their fair shares based on a population equality-based metric of a fair share. They crossed that before the 1950s, and the 1.5 degree fair share crossing in 1970, around 1980 for their 2 degree fair share, and currently more than 2.5 times over their fair share of the 1.5 degree budget. So even if these nations, followed the net zero scenario that many of which have pledged under the Paris Agreement nationally determined contributions, even if they follow those highly ambitious pathways, they would still be more than 2.5 times above their fair share. But at the same time, the rest of the world, where 80% of humanity lives in the global south, is actually right at their 350 part per million fair share. And even if they continued along their accelerating pathways to 2050, they would just be at around their 1.5 degree remaining budget. But of course, we live in a world where that is no longer possible because the global north has already appropriated the atmospheric commons in such a degree that these nations now need to mitigate far more rapidly than would otherwise be required. And so the story with this is essentially the global south would be losing about half of their fair shares. And I believe that forms a very strong justification for a conversation around compensation and around reparations, and just acknowledging that this historical responsibility for the climate breakdown that we are envisioning. So we can talk about that a little bit more in the discussion if there's interest. So that's one approach that we can use, is to dive into one indicator and start looking back over time. Another approach that I've been involved with is leading a study looking at around 150 nations and just downscaling with the best available data from the global donut to the national scale. And here are 4 countries that we can show, just illustrating the range. And I know many of you are tuning in from either Kenya or Indonesia or other places online. So if we look at Kenya, I mean, you can see a lot of red in the center of that donut. So there's large human deprivation that we know, but at the same time, Kenya is not overshooting any of the ecological boundaries that we analyzed in this study. So they're within their fair shares of planetary boundaries. Then we have Indonesia, again, doing a little bit better in terms of social performance based on these internationally comparable metrics, but at the same time overshooting or having a larger footprint on the environment. In China, even more, double whammy of overshooting multiple planetary boundaries while falling short. And in Canada, which is the country where I was born, we can just see, doing relatively well in terms of social performance. Once again, these are internationally comparable metrics. We know there's deprivation in Canada as well and inequality, but it's masked by these global or national aggregates. But what really strikes is just the massive levels of overshoot by those living in Canada. And I think that these images, it just goes to show the challenge of, well, almost it challenges the idea that nations like Canada or the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden, we often hear should be seen as role models. But actually, if you look at many of the high-income nations, they have a picture very similar to what it looks like for Canada. What we do find, because this is, once again, quite challenging, there is a country that's the closest of all, and that's Costa Rica, which is essentially still not in the donut completely, overshooting a little bit, but essentially being the closest in terms of achieving social outcomes. They're the most efficient in terms of achieving social outcomes at a given level of resource use. So there is cause for hope. And I think that it just goes to show that Costa Rica has largely somewhat been aiming towards this with their reforestation campaigns and so on. But even they could do much more. And so I think that this, again, it shows a picture that if we were to direct policies towards actually this goal of meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet, then I do feel confident that we could get there. So here are as many countries, as many donuts as I could fit on a chart. And you can see that down in the bottom left here is Kenya and Indonesia. You get China, Canada way over here on the top right. And what this is meant to show is that where we want to be is in the top left, where we're meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And what we see is that no nation, although Costa Rica is closest, no nation can put up its hand and say that it's there. And I think that it's also at the same time worth noting and acknowledging that these donuts are almost placed separately on a chart, but we also know that they are deeply interconnected through legacies of colonialism, through military power, corporate power, through trade and finance rules of the world economic system, through resource extraction, and on the impacts of climate change, which are felt first and hardest usually by the poorest and most marginalized societies. And often these directionalities go from the richest who are enjoying the benefits of the global economic system to often the poorest in the global south. So I think that's important to acknowledge. And also that if we look at the history of economic development, almost we see that it follows this arrow, right? That it's almost swooshing past the donut where we want to be and moving into overshoot. And these 20th century dynamics are driven by economic growth, and we would characterize them as a degenerative and divisive pathways to wealth, because many are left behind and we're simultaneously, it's highly unsustainable on our planetary home. So what we need to do is every nation must transform, but of course in different pathways in order to get there. So for the lowest income countries of the world, how can they rise up and follow a pathway that's never been done before of meeting the needs of all their people without going into very, very large ecological overshoot? That's a pathway that hasn't been done. And the middle income and emerging countries, how can they reorient, almost do a 90-degree turn from the current trajectories? And they too follow a pathway that's never been done before into the donut. And finally, the highest income countries of the world, like Canada, like many places in the EU and beyond, these countries need to also follow an unprecedented trajectory of massively reducing their levels of pressure on the planet, while at the same time, without adversely impacting their relatively high levels of human well-being. So each of these pathways are fundamental transformations, and it's going to be a challenge, but I think that we need to just recognize that this is the 21st century dynamics that we need in order for equity, for action, and for the people and planet to thrive. And we call these regenerative and distributive pathways, and they are critically by design. So let me talk a little bit about what that means. So essentially, we're arguing that in order to change the future, we need to change these dynamics from a degenerative economic system that's linear, that's taking resources, that makes them into stuff, that uses them for a little bit, often only once, and then throws them away or loses them. And this is running down Earth's critical life-supporting systems. And what we need is to transform to a far more regenerative economic system that uses resources in a much more creatively and collectively. When it comes to biological materials, we allow nature to follow her own regenerative pathways and work with her within the cycles of the living world. And when it comes to technical materials like plastics and metals and other materials that are human created, we should take inspiration from nature and aim to restore and refurbish and use those material sources as much as possible. So some examples, if we think at the level of landscapes, right? So we obviously need to move beyond the degenerative practices of, clear-cutting forests and land degradation, but we need to move also beyond the notion of just zero deforestation and thinking that that's sustainable, because given the amount of damage that has already occurred in most ecosystems around the world, we need to move beyond just do no harm to actively restoring and regenerating. And that is, I believe, what's needed for a regenerative future. Similarly, for manufacturing, clearly we need to move beyond the practice of built-in obsolescence, where phones and electronics and things are designed to break down after a few years, just so that in order to prop up the profit margins of companies and so on. But we can likewise do far more than just being recyclable, right? We can actually be creative and design our products so that they're repairable, so that they're modular, so that we can retrofit and refurbish, and just be generally much more collectively careful and creative with our use of resources. So that's one of the dynamics, degenerative to regenerative. But also, we've inherited a deeply divisive economic system where opportunity and value are being captured in the hands of a very, very few. So, I think the number of billionaires has doubled within the past 15 years or so, from 1,000 billionaires to more than 2,000 billionaires. And that system, that level of inequality, it's just not compatible, I don't believe, with getting into the donuts. And what we need to do is transform to a far more distributive system where we're sharing opportunity and value with all who co-create it. And at the end of the day, given that we are in an interconnected society, that ends up being essentially everyone. So again, we can think of some examples. Here's just a somewhat tongue-in-cheek example of a divisive system, of just being in traffic jam. So divisive one, we're all in our own private vehicles stuck in traffic, but we don't want to have an inclusive system where now we have public transit and we have buses that they too are stuck in a traffic jam. So that is not the level of ambition that we should go for. What we actually need is to redesign and be far more distributive so that there are dedicated mass transit pathways where the buses are completely separated, and so that they're affordable and faster and attractive. And it makes it so that it's irresistible to follow these. Why would you even want to take a private vehicle if you get there faster in a bus? So this is the aspiration. Similarly, for wages, obviously we move beyond poverty wages, but a living wage, to me, it just sounds like such a low bar, right? Of course, we should pay, if workers are dedicating their time and resources to producing and working for us, we should pay them enough to live on. But we can also move to a far more distributive model where not only is it a living wage, but also we can think of different ways of sharing the benefits of, for example, profit shares and many other, designs for cooperative business operations that could be done there. And here's an example from John Lewis. So far I have spoken about essentially the big picture, the global donut, how we could dive into taking into account of responsibility, looking at differences across countries, and as well as the dynamics of how we could change to be regenerative and distributive. But so far it's been very high level. So how can we then land these concepts into the places where we live? Like, for example, some of the work we've been doing with cities. And our argument is that we can think of the global donut, we can think of it as unrolling it in order to open up space between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling, to start mapping what that could look like in each place. And it's work that we've done in Amsterdam, kickstarted there, and is now spread to over 70 cities. And it's underpinned by this framework, which asks a critical question: how can our city or our region become a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And critically, that's a complicated question, but it can be broken apart into these 4 lenses, as we call them, separating local aspirations on one hand, thriving people in a thriving place, and global responsibilities while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet, both locally and globally. And let me just jump into these questions very briefly. So how can all the people of our city thrive? That really depends on, everyone has these basic needs for food, water, health, education, so on. But the ways in which we satisfy those needs, it varies enormously by culture, across places, as well as across time. Those are definitions of what is acceptable. It also changes. So the answer to how we thrive here depends critically upon a public conversation of what that should be. So how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? This is a question informed by the biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus. And she worked with Kate in developing this methodology. And she would say if she was going to Nairobi or to any other place, could say, okay, take me to the wildland next door and show me how nature has learned to cleanse the air and to store carbon and to store groundwater after a storm and to house biodiversity and so on. And how can we recognize that this healthy ecosystem next door can be used as an aspiration, as an ambition, so that the city, the human settlement, can likewise aim to cleanse the air and store carbon and store groundwater and house biodiversity. So it's a radically ambitious change in how we design our cities and our settlements, but at the same time, it's also in a way the most natural thing that we could aim to do. So these are the local aspirations, and in many places, this is where almost the Scandinavian countries and those our conventional role models tend to show up quite well and do relatively well. But of course, that's only half the story, because we also need to recognize our global responsibility. So how can our city respect the health of the whole planet? And this is where the planetary boundaries come in, because we can think of the food and the clothing and the electronics and all the goods and services flowing through a place and the wastes that go out, and ask yourselves, are the carbon emissions and the material use and the various impacts on our planetary home that are associated with that level of consumption, could those be extended to all people? Or what level of unsustainability are we at? And likewise, instead of thinking of the resource use associated with our goods and services, we can also think of how can our city respect the well-being of all people? So again, think of the food and the clothing and the electronics, but instead of the resources, think of who grew the food and who stitched clothing and who assembled the electronics and distributed them and brought them to our doors. And likewise, of course, we're connected with the rest of the world socially through more than just global supply chains, of course. We also have, how are the impacts of past decisions through climate change and through how are those impacting livelihoods in other parts of the world? And how do our policies and the economic system how does that encourage a more solidarity-focused interconnections, or how is it maybe holding those back? How do we deal with migrants? And likewise, there's sports, there's tourism, there's a spaghetti plot of interconnections that we can start to unpack. So these are the four lenses of the Doughnut Unrolled portrait, as we call it. And they are complicated questions when you think about it. But what we've found working with cities and with regions and with policymakers is that even though it's complex, what you start to see is that it provides a more holistic picture. Then you can start to see interconnections across areas that were maybe not visible when you were looking in a more siloed approach. Okay, so these are the core questions, which is, when it comes to the donut, I guess from a data-led perspective, we really always want to be asking, what's our target or our commitment? And is it ambitious enough? And comparing that to how we are doing. So that's the core, and it's somewhat different from other measures of approaching metrics where you're only looking at performance over time or with respect to others. So you always want to have a target, but also start layering on what positive initiatives are underway and what now must we do in order to make it happen. So using data as an input. So I will go very quickly through here, is that this methodology was developed as in April 2020. We followed it up with a methodological guide. And as of April 2022, we now have 5 tools in more than 70 cities and 30 community groups who are working with these. And what we see that as very much a power of peer-to-peer inspiration, where one city can inspire another city, or a community can inspire another community, much more than a person who's standing on the stage. And we think that that power of peer-to-peer inspiration is something that might be strong enough to actually unlock and turn around the trajectories that we're on. So I was going to briefly raise some examples of some places in Barcelona, many in the global north, but also increasingly in Ipoh. They're using it as a city compass in Malaysia, in Thimphu in Bhutan, a very, very interesting integration with their gross national happiness framework and exploring how Doughnut economics could be used as a tool there. Mexico City using it as a scenarios, visualizing future pathways and using that as a communication tool. And of course, so far I've spoken about cities and places, but we're also working with businesses and communities and education. So I just want to wrap up by saying that these 20th century economics, we've left it far behind. What we now need for 21st century is to be looking clearly at the goal, meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet, to be regenerative and distributive, while recognizing that we also need locally relevant indicators and metrics and frameworks that speak to each given place and can take us collectively towards the goal. So I'll wrap it up there. You're all invited to check out the Doughnut Economics Action Lab community platform. You can join, become members, post tools and stories, and so on. But most of all, I really want to hopefully inspire you all for this week, this agenda that you have up ahead, to the extent that Doughnut economics can be useful in these concepts, then yeah, very much looking forward to engaging further. So I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.